Welcome back to, I believe we're on part 6 of the story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Wroblewski. Wroblewski? I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. I think it's Wroblewski. Have a friend with that last name, and I think that's the proper way to say it. That's how we've always said it. We just finished, of course, the funeral of Gar. And can you imagine being such a young child and losing your father and all the other trials that they have in a not easy life? It's full of hard work. But I think that's the measure of a person, is what they do with those situations and how they grow in those. And so let me set our timer, because I would probably just sit here and read the rest of the book if we didn't have a timer going and stop me at some point. All right. This chapter is called The Letters from Fortunate Fields. There followed for each of them good days and bad, and often Edgar's best moments coincided with his mother's worst. She could be cheerful and determinedly energetic for days on end, and then one morning he would walk downstairs and find her hunched over at the kitchen table, haggard and red-eyed. Once lapsed, nothing could deliver her. It worked the same with him, just when normal life felt almost possible, when the world held some kind of order, meaning, even loveliness. The prismatic spray of light through an icicle, the stillness of a sunrise. Some small thing would go awry, and the veil of optimism was torn away. The barren world revealed. I might have to start wearing my glasses. They learned somehow to wait those times out. There was no cure, no answer, no reparation. He returned from school one day in March to find his mother working in her bedroom, her hair a sweaty tangle about her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had already closed up the flaps on a tall stack of boxes and was folding a pair of his father's trousers and placing them in another box. Her gaze barely paused on Edgar when he walked in. Later, he searched to see what had been lost. The drawer that once held his father's belts and ties was filled with his mother's gloves and scarves. On top of the dresser, only her sparse jewelry collection remained, and the wind-up alarm clock. She'd even packed away the photograph of her and his father, newlyweds, sitting on the pier in Door County. He woke one morning tantalized by an idea. If he could catch the orchard trees motionless for 1 second, for half of 1 second, if they stood wholly at rest for their briefest moment, then none of it would have happened. The kitchen door would bang open, and in his father would walk, red-faced and slapping his hands and exclaiming about some newly whelped pup. Childish, Edgar knew, but he didn't care. The trick was not to focus on any single part of any tree, but to look through all of them towards a point in the air. But how insidious a bargain he'd made. Even in the quietest moments, some small thing quivered, and the tableau was destroyed. How many afternoons slipped away like that? How many midnights standing in the spare room watching the trees shiver in the moonlight? Still he watched, transfixed, then blushing because it was futile and silly. He forced himself to walk away. When he blinked, an after-image of perfect stillness. To think it might happen when he wasn't watching. He turned back before he reached the door, and through the window glass, a dozen trees strummed by the winter wind, skeletons dancing pairwise, fingers raised to heaven. Stop it, he told himself, just stop. And he watched some more. The work to be done was staggering. Simplest was the maintenance of the kennel, cleaning the pens, feeding and watering the dogs, shoveling snow from the runs, and an infinity of minor repairs on the kennel's mechanical workings. Then there was nursery duty, checking the pregnant mothers, washing the teats of the nursing and weaning mothers, taking the temperature and weights of newborn of newborns. For the blind and deaf neonates, there were touch and scent regimes to be followed, neatly penciled in Gar's hand on a yellowing paper tacked to the whelping room wall. For the newly open-eyed, there was a schedule of experiences from the jingling of car keys to the appearance of an old bicycle horn, which they might sniff until Edgar squeezed the rubber bulb and timed how long before they crept back. A patch of carpet to walk on, a tube, a block, sandpaper, ice, the weekly roll and hold until they kicked and yipped, keeping one eye on the second hand of the clock. The sessions with aunts and uncles, learning manners while the mother rested. For everything there were entries on log sheets, milestones checked off, reactions recorded, charts updated and compiled, stories of each life. Photographs at 4, 6, 8, and 12 weeks, and then 6 and 9 and 12 and 18 months. Frontal, lateral, rear, and orodental on Tri-X. The dogs positioned in front on the painted calibration grid on the medicine room wall. At night there was the house rotation schedule, bringing in pairs or trios, and the pedigree research, and visits by stud dogs, and the heat schedules of the mothers, and the practice placements and negotiations with potential owners. But it was the training that consumed them. The infants needed to learn the simplest things: to look, to listen, to watch, to wait. The 18-month-olds needed finish work and evaluation, and the adolescents, those robbers, thieves, muggers, and bullies who knew exactly what you wanted and devoted themselves to the opposite, needed every spare minute and more. One evening, after they had come in from the kennel, Edgar's mother asked him to sit at the table. On a sheet of paper, she'd drawn a schedule with columns labeled Edgar and Trudy. "We need to divide up the work," she said. "We're both doing everything right now. I'm not so worried about the nursery. Pearl's an experienced mother. She won't need much watching. But I am worried about placing them. Your father spent so much time on the telephone. I have a lot of catching up to do." She paused and took a deep breath. "And all that is going to detract from the training, the only bright side to this whole thing is that the oldest litter is completely placed. It gives us a few months of breathing room. Then the next litter is going to be yours." "I don't think they've been spoken for." She looked at him to double-check this. He nodded. His father hadn't broached the issue of placing Edgar's litter, and it wasn't something Edgar had been eager to hurry along. "We have a few months then. I need to go over the contacts. For all I know, Gar has spoken agreements with people. I hope I won't need to travel. I don't know how we'll manage if I do." She was thinking out loud. He let her go on and sat listening, and then she stopped short and turned to him. "There is another option, Edgar, and we need to talk about it. We can sell the breeding stock and shut down the kennel. After these litters are placed, would be done. We could probably place them all by the end of summer if we wanted to. We would have to move into town. I'm sure I could." He was already shaking his head. "No, listen, we have to consider it. We're going to have to work so hard there'll be no time for anything else. Have you thought about that? What it will be like? In a year or so, you'll want to go out for track or football. You might not think so now, but when other boys are doing those things, you're going to resent being stuck out here handling dogs morning and night. What I'm afraid of is that there'll come a time when you hate getting on the bus to come home, and I'll know it when it happens. That's the other thing. This isn't always going to be your home. In 4 years, you graduate. I can't possibly run this kennel alone. And even if I could, I'm not going to live out here by myself. 5 years one way or another doesn't matter much, Edgar." "It matters to me. Besides, how do you know I'm going to leave here?" "Don't be ridiculous. You're going to college." "I'm not. I haven't even thought about college." "You will," his mother said. "You need to understand that there are alternatives. You're being closed-minded. Staying here and working dogs might be the hardest thing, not the easiest. Or the best. As a trainer, you're no great shakes, Edgar. Sleeping with them in the mow doesn't accomplish much, no matter how nice it feels." Edgar felt himself blushing. It's not so hard to guess what's going on when there's silence up there for hours and you come stumbling down with straw in your hair. I know how tempting it is. I've done it myself. You sleep in the mow? She shrugged, refusing to be drawn off track. My point is, maybe that's not where your aptitudes lie. Oh, of course you're good with the dogs. Quit looking so punctured. Your worst quality as a trainer is your pride, Edgar. If we're going to make a go of this kennel, you're going to have to learn so much more, and you're going to have to take it seriously. You only understand the basics, and you're going to have to, until now you've been training pups and helping her father. Training yearlings is much more exciting. I can handle them and do all the rest too. It's impossible for me to do this. But I want to learn. I want to help. What if I said I wasn't sure I could teach you what you need to know? You can. I know you can. I've been watching you all my life. Yes, you have. So why at the age of 9 months does Tinder bolt whenever he gets a chance? That's not fair. Who said anything about fair? His mother's voice cracked a little on the word. He could guess her thoughts. How exactly might the word fair apply to any part of this situation? Furthermore, what she had said about his training skills was true. He was lazy and indulgent. What he liked was the attention of the pups, not the training. He was inconsistent. He worked them on skills he already knew and avoided more difficult things. And worst of all, he understood there was more he should be doing, but he had no idea what it was. And that made him feel ashamed. You need to realize that this is a business, like a grocery store or a gas station. You're going to find out that's an awfully cold-blooded view. You're asking to be a partner in it. You'll have to think of this place as a business first and a playground with dogs last. You're talking down to me, he signed. I know what we do. Do you? What do you think? What do you think we sell? He must have looked at her as if she were insane. Dogs. Dogs, of course. Wrong. You see, Edgar, it's not as obvious as you think. Anyone can sell dogs. People give them away. Do you know what we charge for each dog? He didn't. His father had negotiated these things, and it wasn't something he had talked much about. $1,500 for a trained 18-month-old dog. $1,500? Yes, she said. Your litter could be worth between $9,000 and $10,000. If not, it's not now, but it could be. Well, how come we aren't rich? She laughed. Because most of that money goes towards food, medicine, expenses. We reimburse people who take care of the older dogs. If we place 20 dogs a year, which is about what we average, we squeak by. And it's not easy to find 20 people willing to pay that much for an adult dog. Most people want pups, you know. He nodded. Do other dogs cost that much? Some. A few cost more. Litters out of a show ring, champions. She rolled her eyes when she said show ring. Her attitude about that dog fancy was just shy of total contempt. Almost all dogs cost less, though. Much less. How can we charge so much? That's exactly what you need to learn, Edgar. When you know the answer to that question, you'll know why we can place our dogs at all. Much less at that price. You'll also understand what it is we're selling. Can't you just tell me? I could try, but there are no words for some things, Edgar. Let me ask you a question. You've been around plenty of dogs in town. Do they seem just like ours? Different color, different breed, but otherwise the same? Not exactly. Kind of scatterbrained, right? Yeah, but they aren't trained, most of them. Do you think that's the only difference? Our pups mature more slowly. Do you understand that? They don't have their first heat until they're 2 years old. Or their first heat until they're 2 years old. And when they're little, you know how frustrating that can be? Look at Essay. We're still working on simple obedience with her when she was 6 months old, long after any mutt would have that stuff down pat. But try doing a shared gaze exercise with one of those town dogs and see what happens. But that's easy. She laughed and stood and turned on the radio to the country western station she liked, and they cleared the table. She hummed under her singing to keep her mind off something else. Before Edgar went to bed, his mother said one last thing. Edgar, think about what we discussed. Give it a while. Then we need to do one of two things. Either we stay and make this kennel work, and that's going to require you to learn Finnish training, or We begin dismantling the kennel. There's no point in anything halfway. Edgar nodded. It sounded so rational, the alternative so clear. He knew what he wanted the moment his mother posed her question, and he knew what she wanted him to want, despite her attempt at objectivity. Another life was inconceivable. It would be much later before he'd realized they'd seduced themselves that night, seduced themselves into believing they understood all the costs and consequences of what they wanted, that no mistake they might make could equal what had already happened, that their calm wasn't simply a veneer. Since they were in town already, Trudy decided they would eat lunch at the Mellon Diner. And as soon as they were seated, Dr. Papineau hailed from across the room, and Trudy walked over to him. Edgar sat listening to the lunchtime chatter and looking out the window. In the corner booth, a little girl was staring at him. A moment later, she marched past, whispering in a quiet sing-song, and disappeared into the bathroom. When he glanced back from the window, he discovered her standing beside his booth. "Hi," she said. She was maybe 5 years old, dressed in a blue jumpsuit with a rainbow-colored elephant across her bib, her hair a yellow tangle of ringlets. She leaned toward him confidentially. "Mama says you can't talk," she lisped. "Is that really true?" He looked at her and nodded. "Not even a whisper?" He shook his head. She drew back and gave him an appraising look. "How come?" she asked. He shook his head and shrugged. The little girl glanced back at her family, oblivious to her absence, and narrowed her eyes. "Mama says I should learn some of that from you, but I can't. I tried, but things just come out of me. I said a person who can talk ought to talk. Don't you think that's true?" He nodded. "My grandma's like me. Want to know what my grandma says?" Now he was sure he didn't know this little girl, and he didn't know her mother or her grandmother either, yet the more he looked at her face, the more familiar it became, as if he'd seen it often, but at a distance. He glanced back at the corner booth, and her family didn't have one of their dogs. He would have recognized them at once if they had. "Well, do you want to know or not?" the girl asked, stamping her foot on the linoleum. He shrugged again. "Okay, sure." "She says that before you were born, God told you a secret he didn't want anyone else to know." He looked at her. There wasn't much a person could say in response to a thing like that. He considered scribbling out a note to the little girl. I could just write it down. But he thought that was not her point, and she was probably too young to read anyway. He particularly wanted to tell her she didn't have to whisper. People made mistakes like that, talking extra loud or getting nervous, but the little girl wasn't nervous, not in the least. She acted as if she had known him all her life. She crooked her finger at him, and he leaned down and she cupped her hand by his ear. "You could tell me the secret," she whispered. "I wouldn't tell, I promise. Sometimes it makes it easier if just one other person knows." At first the little girl stood wide-eyed and placid. He sat back and looked at her. Then her eyes squinted into crescents and her lips drew together in an angry little circle. "You don't remember, do you?" she scolded, and now she wasn't whispering. "You forgot!" Edgar's mother on the far side of the dining room stopped talking with Dr. Papineau and turned. "Don't look at me," he signed. "I don't even know who she is." Abruptly, the little girl turned and stormed off. She had taken 5 or 6 steps before she whirled to face him again. She was a terribly dramatic child, and Edgar had a glimpse of what it must be like in her house. She was probably staging little scenes like this all the time, over eating her vegetables and watching television. She scrunched up her face as though thinking through a naughty problem. "Would you tell me if you did remember?" she asked finally. "Yes." Her expression brightened into a smile, and her face was still oddly familiar, still impossible to place. "Oh," she said, "okay." Then she skipped away. Before she reached the corner booth, her attention was caught by a baby in a high chair, and she stopped to poke the baby and ask questions when it started to cry. "What was that about?" Trudy said when she slipped into the booth. "I don't know." "Maybe you have an admirer," she said. And for the 3rd time since they'd walked into the diner, he could think of no better reply than a shrug. They worked hard to distract one another whenever they recognized bleakness descending. Edgar pulled Trudy to the kitchen table to play checkers and eat popcorn. One night she snuck his entire litter into the house without waking him, and in the morning when he opened his eyes, 8 dogs lifted their heads to look at him. Edgar opened the Jungle Book and discovered that, for the first time since the funeral, he could concentrate enough to read, and reading was more comfort than anything else. Kaa's hunting, tales of the Banderlog. It didn't matter. It touched the old life, the life before. He watched the television for news of Alexandra Honeywell and Star Child Colony, and that too provided a comfort. Yet in the mornings, the front of his ribcage ached as if someone had dropped an anvil on his chest in the night. The whelping rooms consoled him, also the workshop, despite what had happened there, but it was the row of paint-chipped file cabinets standing like sentinels against the back wall of the workshop that drew him most. Atop the cabinets sat a small reference library, Working Dogs by Humphrey, Warner and Brooks, Genetics in relation to Agriculture by Babcock and Clausen, Veterinary Techniques for the Farm by Wilson and Barbaro, Genetics and the Social Behavior of Dogs by Scott and Fuller, and of course, the New Webster Encyclopedic Dictionary of the English Language. The Master Litter book was there too, row upon row of ledgered names. Row upon row of ledgered names and litter numbers, one line for every Sawtelle dog, all the way back to his grandfather's time. 1,000 times he must have watched his father run a finger along a page and then snatch an overstuffed folder out of a drawer. Generations of dogs filled those metal drawers. If ever a folder turned up missing, his father said it was as if they had lost the dog itself. And he would search and search, saying, "These records are it. Without them, we wouldn't know how to plan the next litter. We wouldn't know what a dog meant." The bottom drawers of the oldest cabinet contained a hash of newspaper articles and letters, most addressed to Edgar's grandfather. There was a letter from a man in Ohio whose dog had rescued him from drowning. Another from a woman in Washington State described how her dogs had interacted when she'd been attacked by a mountain lion. Some letters were paper-clipped to newspaper articles from faraway cities. The Boston Globe, the New York Times, even the London Times. The pattern was clear. His grandfather had been writing to people because their dogs had done something remarkable, something reported in the newspaper. One letter in particular caught Edgar's attention. It was postmarked New Jersey, and the name, Brooks, sounded familiar. He read the first few lines before he stood and double-checked the spine of Working Dogs and then turned back to the letter. May 2nd, 1934, Morristown, New Jersey. Dear Mr. Sawtelle, thank you for your interest in our work. I'm gratified that Working Dogs is of some assistance and not a futile documentary effort. Unfortunately, I have no plans that would take me to Wisconsin in the near future, as our work demands my presence here. As one who works with dogs, I trust you understand. First, to your question, we do not attempt to train our dogs to make complex choices between training objectives. Of course, the dogs make substantial judgments many times a day, both in training and in service, but a command's intent is always unambiguously clear. For example, when recalled, the dog should always come. When told to stay, it should always stay. I can think of no benefit in asking a dog to possibly come when recalled. Scent tracking requires a high level of choice making, but not the kind you've asked about. We're eminently practical in these matters. Our goal is to produce the best possible working dogs, and consequently, we emphasize predictability. I would not like to guess whether the choice-making behavior you ask about can be trained for or tested accurately, or whether it is hereditable. I have no more efficacious proving procedures in mind than those you suggest. This whole question of choice between objectives had been a cause for idle speculation on my part the last few nights, and I have even gone as far as discussing it with my colleagues. The consensus seems to be that even if it were possible, there would be little utility in it for service dogs. Second, for reasons I suspect you already understand, we cannot consider an exchange of dogs. The 6 strains that comprise the Fortunate Fields breeding program represent thoroughly researched bloodlines. In order to select a foundation stock of just 21 animals, we examined the pedigree data of hundreds of candidates, crossed cross-indexed against their show and working titles. As a result, all of our dogs have a proven ancestry that has produced both excellent conformation and great success at work. Introducing an unknown into the bloodlines is out of the question. I should also like to offer 2 observations. First, by beginning your breeding program with dogs you found excellent in temperament and structure, but of unpedigreed stock, you've made attaining your objective, and I admit I don't fully understand it, immeasurably harder. While it is true that out of selection of German Shepherd dogs was essentially accidental, the choice to begin with a well-documented lineage was not. We know, for example, that our dogs have been structurally sound for at least 5 generations. When questions arise about the heritability of some trait, we can contact the owners of ancestors 2 and sometimes 3 generations back. For the goal of producing a scientifically constructed working dog, this is invaluable. Without such information, one might expect that the first dozen generations would exhibit extreme variability in type. To bring order from that chaos, one would have to aggressively inbreed, with that predictable amplification of undesirable as well as desirable traits. I also feel compelled to say that it is breathtakingly naive to imagine creating a breed of dog in the first place. To do so by selecting what you arbitrarily think are outstanding examples, whatever dog happens to catch your fancy, and crossing them into your line will only result in a jumble, and might well create unhealthy or unviable offspring. I warn you against this course. You seem to grasp the principles of heredity, and thus I am astonished at what you think you might accomplish. You, the canine species, and our society would be better served if you accepted the realities of animal husbandry. Yours is a common vanity, one that every breeder has indulged during a weak moment. But the best of them put such thoughts aside and ask what is right for the breed. I hope you soon do as well. What you are attempting is, in essence, the opposite of our endeavor, and I cannot recommend it. A blank space appeared in the text, and then the letter continued. Mr. Sawtelle, after finishing the last passage, I set this letter aside for some days, too upset to finish it. I felt I should either write it again with a more civil tone or simply not post it. Though I'm not less adamant today, in the interim I found I will be traveling to Minneapolis. This is unusual and unexpected, but if I've read my map correctly, I may have time for a brief side trip on my return, the purpose of which will be to convince you in person of your folly. In addition, as a scientist, I feel some obligation to review your stock, on the remote chance it might be of use to us. I should be traveling about 6 weeks hence and done with my business in Minneapolis around June 15th. Signed, A.B. The letter was a curiosity. Edgar had read Working Dogs years before and knew that Brooks was one of the original breeders on the Fortunate Fields project. The makeshift library atop the file cabinets held several books on that subject, as well as articles about Buddy, the most famous of those dogs. Guys, my dog's name is Buddy. Oh, sorry, ADD. Let's see. As well as articles about Buddy, the most famous of those dogs. Fortunate Fields had originated through the philanthropy of a woman named Dorothy Eustace, whose idea was to breed dogs to help humanity, in particular as guide dogs for the blind. An institution called the Seeing Eye had been established to carry that work forward. Fortunate Fields was interesting because guide dogs for the blind needed to be of a special temperament, unflappable, easy to train, and happiest at work. This ruled out dogs that were, for example, unnerved by new surroundings or too laconic to be relied upon for steady work. The Sawtelle family legend, myth, Edgar had always supposed, was that his grandfather had contacted the Fortunate Fields breeders in the early days, and that one of them had taken pains to advise him on breeding and training. The story went that the Sawtelle dogs even carried the blood of Buddy. Edgar fingered through the letters. There were several more from Brooks. The next was dated 2 months later. July 2nd, 1934, Morristown, New Jersey. Mr. Sawtelle, I apologize for rushing off. Your hospitality was more than I should have hoped for, indeed, more than I should have indulged in. After seeing your dogs, I understand your enthusiasm. However, I must repeat that there is no possibility that we could use them as fortunate field stock. Having also seen your records, I understand that the difference between our approaches is one of philosophy, not technique. You are as selective in your ways as we are at fortunate fields. If I'm repeating what I already said while visiting, I apologize. Some of it is unclear to me now. I do not think you have much chance of success, though your definition of success is less precise than ours. That may be more sensible, as you've argued, but it's not scientific, and in science, progress is necessarily slow. I also cannot let you ship a bitch here to be bred. Although I am on your side in this matter, my colleagues are unconvinced. However, I tell you the following in confidence. A gentleman named Conrad McAllister has been living with a dog of ours, Amos, just outside of Minneapolis, for 2 years now. Amos is a sibling of Buddy's, and every bit the dog she is. We consider Amos to be among our great successes, though Buddy gets all the publicity. With my endorsement, I believe Conrad would permit Amos to sire a litter with a bitch of your choosing. I could make sure you had the advantage of our full documentation on Amos, since you would be in a position to appreciate what it meant. Finally, I would like to mention a personal matter, with the desire that it need never be discussed again. Our night at the Hollow, as I believe the establishment was called, culminated in a rather unfortunate, indeed foolish, incident. The young lady you introduced me to has mailed several letters to my home address since then, indicating that she would rather not put the event into the proper perspective. Rest assured, I have determined that this is only a matter of misplaced affection and not something medical in nature. I believe you know her. If my memory of that night was not completely destroyed by whatever was in those shot glasses, I shall never again hear the name Leinenkugel without some degree of nausea. I'm grateful the beverage isn't sold here. In any case, I've suggested to her that the best thing might be a subtle remembrance in the form of a puppy related to the famous Buddy, which she would acquire from you. I've explained to her that this would be Buddy's paternal nephew or niece, but as you well know, those not involved in animal husbandry have little interest in exact filial relationships and no appreciation of their significance. In any event, if you would agree to make that possible, I would be happy to send Conrad a letter endorsing the mating, and you would have my deepest gratitude. I believe you have undertaken a particularly interesting project, Mr. Sawtelle. If my prior letter seemed harsh, please accept my apologies. Most anxiously awaiting your reply, Alvin Brooks. Postscript. As for naming, I see no reason to call them anything other than Sawtelle dogs, or perhaps just Sawtelles. If they amount to anything besides well-trained mongrels, they will, after all, have been the product of your vision. And then a third letter, postmarked almost 5 years later, November 18th, 1938, Morristown, New Jersey. John, I do not share this desire to wax philosophical about the nature of men and dogs. It leads to discussions that are unscientific at best and a waste of intellectual force at worst. You are talking religion, not science. One part of your letter intrigued me, however, your discussion of Canis posteris, the next dogs, as you call them. I'm familiar with the theory of the dire wolf, that gigantic ancestor of wolves that trod the prehistoric earth. I, like you, believe that our modern dogs are descended from the wolves of antiquity, perhaps 100,000 years past. As you say, that gives us 3 points, more than enough to plot a trajectory. If they belong to the same evolutionary branch of the species, that is, the dire wolf may have been something entirely separate from Canis lupus, an alternative form that natural selection toyed with and discarded. I must make something clear before I go on. You speak of natural selection and evolution as if they were one and the same, but natural selection, the undirected survival of an individual or individuals, is merely one mechanism of evolution and not the only one. Mutation, for example, is another mechanism, one way in which novelty gets introduced. As you well know, conscientious animal husbandry serves the same function in domesticated animals that natural selection serves in the wild. Yet, in geometry, given 2 points, a line may be drawn. Perhaps the same is true in biology. Suppose those 2 points we take are the wolf and the domestic dog. That does not imply something else along the same line. The next dog, as you like to phrase it. But this is where your thinking goes awry, for along any such biological line, the farther the points are not more advanced than the earlier points, and they are only better adapted. That is, evolution and sophistication are not necessarily one and the same, and so your endless speculation on the nature of canis posteris, and hence the next small change that will make them better workers, which is my dream, or companions, which is yours, is futile, since the forces of selection would either have to know in advance what small change is desired, or be able to recognize it when it happens by pure accident. The latter is not a realistic possibility. Mutations occur at an extremely low rate in any population, and of course the chance of a specific mutation that would better adapt a dog for companionship, well, it is possible, but statistically unlikely. Which leaves you in the uncomfortable position of speculating on a change that cannot happen unless you already know what it will be, or have the sort of time on your hands that natural selection has. That's the crux of the layman's trouble in understanding evolution. It works on a timescale so far beyond personal experience that one must train oneself to think in eons, not decades. Here at Fortunate Fields, we have carefully defined objective criteria, known in advance, by which our animals may be measured for fitness. We know exactly which behaviors to select for. Therefore, though our progress must be slow, we are confident it will also be steady. Since you insist on speculating, however, I will say this much. There are limits to what even the most rigorously scientific breeding program can accomplish, based not only on the foundation stock and the limits of precision we have for measuring the dogs, but on limits that come from within us. Limits, in other words, of our own imagination, and of ourselves as conscientious human beings. In the end, to create better dogs, we will have to become better people. And that, sir, is the last speculation you will hear from me along these lines. There was more in the letter, an exchange of kennel techniques, clarification of older letters. What interested Edgar was how Alvin Brooks had signed the letters. To move such a formal man from that first outraged letter to one in which he closed with, affectionately, must have taken dozens, if not hundreds, of exchanges. Why had these, of all the letters, been kept? Probably chance, he knew, but he dug back into the file cabinets to see what else he could find, opening letter after letter and setting it aside. It all made him think about their records. The paperwork on a dog didn't end when it left the kennel. At his father's request, new owners sent back letters every few months describing how the dog they'd adopted was getting along. When a dog reached 5 years of age, his father had contacted the owners to fill out another form. And when the dog died, yet another form was filled out, recording the age, cause of death, behavior late in life, and so on. Edgar's father sometimes even called the dog's veterinarian. As a result, the file for every dog expanded over time until it was stuffed with notes, letters, photographs. A litter, Edgar's father once told him, is like an x-ray of its parents, and its parents' parents, but an x-ray that takes years to develop, and even then it's faint. The more x-rays you have, the better picture you get. This made sense. A dog might sire half a dozen litters, each with 6 or 7 pups. That meant 40 or more pups who reflected the quality of the sire. If, for an extreme example, cleft palates showed up in every litter, meaning pups that had to be put down, you knew that the sire carried a propensity toward cleft palate. Of course, if a sire produced cleft palates more than once, they stopped breeding him, and a red slash was drawn across the dog's folder. Just before a dog left the kennel, it was evaluated one last time. They call this the finish. There were no special tests in the finish, just the same things they'd always tested for, the same exercises, the same measurements. The difference was this time the results were rolled up into a numerical score representing the dog in maturity. That finish score was the best indication of what its ancestors had passed on, the best x-ray. Once a finish score was assigned, Edgar's father recalculated all its ancestors' finish scores, going back 5 generations. This was how evidence accumulated about how true the dog bred, how reliably it passed on its qualities, good or bad, to succeeding generations. A second number told them how many of the dog's progeny had contributed to the master score, an index of confidence. When planning litters, the choice between two dogs with nearly identical finish scores favored the dog with the highest index of confidence, the one who had been tested more thoroughly. This was a system Edgar's grandfather had worked out and refined, apparently in long discussions with Brooks, and which his father had practiced, modified, and improved. It wasn't a perfect scheme, of course. While the finish score gave an idea of how well a dog fared in testing, there were intangibles to consider. Not temperament, which they broke down into individual behaviors and assessed, and not physical qualities, which were easily measured, but how the dog combined all these things, for the whole of every dog was always greater than the sum of its parts. Some, for example, seemed capable of inspiration. They clued in on a new way of doing things more often than others. There was no way to measure this, and there was the dog's personality, which was distinct from its temperament. A dog with a keen sense of humor would find ways to make jokes with you, and could be a joy to work with. Others were serious and contemplative. Sorry, it's early. And they were good for other reasons. Edgar's father had sometimes grumbled that all he did was keep track of a dog's faults, though what he meant was even the best records in the world couldn't capture the whole of the dog. They could record only what could be measured, and the measuring and testing of the dogs, the follow-up calls and letters, the reassessment of the ancestors of a place dog, all served to remind his father of a dog's total character. When it came time to plan a litter, the scores and numbers were only a guide. It hadn't been unusual for him to select against the numbers based on intuition, but his father's complaint also pointed to the fact that the records mainly prevented bad pairings, breeding, say, two dogs that tended to produce weak fronts. That was the interesting thing about planning a cross. Two brilliant dogs couldn't be bred if it risked a little litter full of stiffles, so straight the dogs would be crippled by the time they were 5 years old. And so the first question about any potential pairing was not how great the offspring would be, but what problems it might produce. Thinking about all this, Edgar began to understand what his mother meant when she'd claimed not to have the words to describe what made their dogs valuable. Partly it was the training. They'd spent long hours doing crazy walking, stays, releases, shared gaze drills, and all the rest until the pups paid attention to where they were going and where they were looking. They learned that a certain expression on a person's face meant that something interesting lay behind them or in another room. He'd taken that for granted, but now that his mother had pointed it out, he saw how uncommon this was. So a dog's value came from the training and the breeding. And by breeding, Edgar supposed he meant both the bloodlines, the particular dog in their ancestry, and all the information in the file cabinets, because the files, with their photographs, measurements, notes, charts, cross-references, and scores, told them the story of the dog, what a dog meant, as his father put it. Sometimes when Edgar got an idea, a whole series of other ideas clicked into place right behind it, as if they'd been logjammed somewhere in his mind, waiting for the next to clear. Suddenly, he saw how the training, the breeding, the record-keeping, it all worked together. How the training tested the dogs for their qualities, their ability to learn different kinds of work. That explained the training notes and why the Sawtelles had to raise the dogs to maturity. If they placed a pup, they wouldn't know what kind of dog it became. But the Sawtelles could compare them because they trained every dog. So it made sense that a dog's finish score could alter the scores of its ancestors, which in turn influenced the dogs used for the next mating, as if every dog had a voice in selecting the following generation. Edgar closed his eyes and waited until he could hold it all in his mind. And once that happened, he wanted so badly to ask his father about it, to be sure he had understood things correctly, that it nearly made him cry. But the only way left to him was through his records. And yet he felt this, but couldn't find the words for it. Something else made the dogs valuable too, something that hadn't been among this sudden cascade of ideas. He wished he could read his grandfather's side of the correspondence to understand what it meant by the next dogs. No matter how naive or wild-eyed his grandfather might have sounded to Brooks, Edgar thought John Sawtelle's vision might not have been so quixotic. He had a feeling, in fact, that it might already have come to pass. Lessons and dreams. A few weeks after the funeral, after the shock had worn off and some of the kennel routines were established again, Edgar's dreams began. In them, his father did the most ordinary things, walking along the driveway to fetch the mail, reading in his armchair, lifting a puppy in the dim light of the whelping room to take a closer look. Edgar looked for some connection between his last waking thoughts and what he saw when he fell asleep. One night he found himself walking creekside with his father, the sumac and chokecherry green and jungle lush, though he knew, even in his dream, that outside his window the fields lay buried under thick drifts of snow. Then his father turned and said something important. When Edgar woke, he lay still, trying to fix those words in his mind. But by the time he shuffled into the kitchen, he couldn't even remember whether his father had signed or spoken. Trudy peered at him over her coffee cup. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing. Was it a dream?" she asked. "Your father?" Her guess surprised him. He didn't know how to answer. Was she having dreams too? It seemed possible. Some mornings she looked as fragile as a baby bird. She was trying to shield him from whatever bad feelings she had. He could see that. She stayed up late, sitting at the kitchen table and pretending to work. Half the time he cooked dinner for her because she seemed to have forgotten to eat. She only pushed the food around on her plate and then stood and began to wash dishes. When she talked with people in town, she was calm and poised, though tired-looking, but beneath it Edgar saw something fractured. And then there was, he discovered, a kind of selfishness in him about those dreams. They might have been false memories, but they were memories nonetheless, stolen time. In the end, he just shrugged and headed out to start the morning chores. He hadn't fooled her, but they didn't talk about it either, which for the time being was good enough. His mother had him set up in a low barrier in the mow, a pair of uprights with dowels sticking out like a track and field hurdle. A rough curtain of red ribbon hung from the rod. She asked Edgar to bring up one of the dogs. At first he intended to use Essay, who loved to climb and jump. Then he remembered his mother's admonition about training the dogs on exercises that they had already mastered, so he chose Finch instead. He stayed the dog on the far side of the barrier, then walked to his mother's side. "Have him jump the barrier," she said. She wasn't asking for a stupendous feat. The rod was on the lowest set of dowels, 6 inches above the floor. Finch could step over it. When Edgar signaled a recall, Finch wandered forward, sniffed the uprights, and skirted at them without stepping over the rod. He trotted the remaining distance and finished in front of Edgar, swishing his tail and glancing back and forth between the two of them. "What did you think of that?" his mother asked. "He did it wrong," Edgar sighed. "All right, let me put it another way. What did you do wrong?" "Nothing. He knew exactly what I wanted. He had to go out of his way to avoid it." "Is that so?" Edgar looked at Finch, whose mouth was hanging open slightly, ears erect, eyes shining with mischief. Of course Finch knew he was supposed to jump the barrier. Not only had Finch seen other dogs do the same thing, but Finch himself had jumped that barrier many times, even when it was set much higher, though never reliably, Edgar had to admit. Certainly Finch wasn't scared of the barrier as some dogs were. And on top of that all, it was obviously the shortest path between them. "Yes," he signed. "You saw him." "Okay," his mother said. "We'll forget for a moment that when Finch finally got here, you didn't acknowledge it. He's still waiting for that. By the way, but he's a patient dog. He knows you'll get around to it. There's even a chance he won't have forgotten what you're praising him for by then. In the meantime, why don't you take him back around? Maybe we can do this over and figure out what the trouble is." Abashed, Edgar scratched Finch's chest and smoothed the fur over the dog's forehead. He looped his fingers through his collar, but before he could take a step, his mother said, "Stop." He turned to look at her. Why did you just praise Finch? He laughed silently, shoulders shaking. His mother seemed determined to ask absurd questions. Because he came when called. Really? She looked puzzled. Okay, well. She raised an arm and signaled them forward with a limp hand, a queen dismissing courtiers. Proceed. He led Finch across the mow, giving the uprights a wide berth so as not to accidentally reinforce the incorrect path. When they'd gotten halfway back to the starting position, his mother again shouted, Stop! They stopped. The barrier was within reach of Edgar's left hand. Far away, near the mow door, his mother stood with her fingers woven into her hair like a madwoman, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. What in the world do you think you're doing? She said. This was an act, he knew, and it made him laugh all over again. Taking Finch to his stay spot? But you didn't go over that barrier. You didn't ask me to go over the barrier. Exactly, she said. You see, you can't train a dog to do something if you don't know what you want him to do. When you recalled Finch, you didn't know what you wanted. How can I tell? Because you said one thing to him and expected something else, just like I did. If I had known what I wanted from you, I would have asked for it. But I didn't know until you were already past the barrier. Now I know what I want. Come back here. You've taught me what I want. Dutifully, he led Finch back to her side. Thank you, she said, bowing a little. You're welcome, he signed, bowing in return. He was having a hard time keeping the grin off his face. Who was the teacher in that exchange? He pointed at her. Oh, really? Oh, I taught you. So who was the teacher? I was. Right. When do you say when someone goes out of their way to teach you something? What do you say? Thank you. Exactly. Why did you praise Finch before? Well, because he taught me something. Are you asking me or telling me? Well, telling, because he taught me something. Exactly. When his mother dropped her theatrical stance and smiled, he wasn't sure where his tears came from. He didn't feel sad. In fact, he was laughing, but his vision suddenly blurred up. It's going to make me blur up. Tears of shock, he supposed, at discovering he had spent his entire life on the kennel and yet still misunderstood something so elementary. And the force of her personality could be overwhelming. He turned away and passed his sleeve over his face before something even more embarrassing could happen. Goodness. She watched for a moment. Oh, Edgar, she said, I didn't mean to be hard on you. I'm just trying to make a point. Remember what I said about not being able to explain what people pay us for? Oh, sorry, friends. I wasn't being coy. One of the things you need to learn is that training is almost never about words. I could try to explain these things, but the words wouldn't mean much. It's like what just happened here. I told you the words for this idea, right? When we started. But, sorry. But that didn't mean you understood them. But maybe now you see why someone would pay for a trained dog instead of a pup. He thought about this, then nodded. Especially another trainer? He nodded again. So why don't you take this fabulous teacher named Finch back over the barrier and stay him, and let's try again. This time she had him stand across the mow beside Finch with a short lead attached to his collar, and she performed the recall. Edgar ran alongside Finch and made sure he had jumped the barrier. He only needed one correction and 3 trials. Then they switched and she ran alongside him for 3 more trials, while Edgar did the recall. He thanked Finch each time for teaching him something. In return, the dog's eyes glinted, and he tried to put his feet on Edgar's chest and lick his face. Quite happily, Edgar let him. Dr. Papineau came for dinner several nights later. Here it is, he announced as he walked in. He was accompanied by a blast of cold air and a white bakery box, held aloft like a prize. A longtime widower, Dr. Papineau patronized the cafes and bakeries between Park Falls and Ashland. He held strong opinions on who served the best of his favorite foods, from eggs over easy to strawberry cheesecake. Lemon meringue, he declared. I bought it by hand. This joke was part of the tradition as well. I told Betsy down at the Melon Bakery to set aside the best she had, and she did, too. She's got a little crush on me, I think, ever since I heroically removed her cat's kidney stones. Edgar's mother lifted the box from Papineau's hand. Well, she'll have to get in line behind the waitresses down in Park Falls, she said, smiling. Cold enough for you, Paige? Nope, he said cheerfully. I'd like to see it colder than this. Oh, really? She said. Why is that? Because when I'm soaking in the Florida sun, I like to read the newspaper and check the weather here. And if I don't see solid minus signs, I feel cheated. Ah, yes, the annual migration. Oh, yes, I enjoy it more every year. They spent dinner talking about the kennel. Edgar's mother had taken one of the older dogs to see Dr. Papineau that week, and he had diagnosed hypothyroid. They talked about the medication. Then he inquired about how she and Edgar were holding up, commenting obliquely on how tired they looked. Trudy put him off. Things had been hard, she said, but they were under control. They had a schedule worked out. Edgar's mother embroidered their success a bit. While it was true that things were slowly returning to normal, it also wasn't unusual for her to be in the barn until 9 o'clock, with another hour spent over paperwork at the kitchen table. Edgar worked evenings as well, pulling out dogs for grooming and training. He'd negotiated for 2 hours with them each night. Trudy said there had to be time for schoolwork, and if he was efficient, an hour and a half would be plenty for training. Saturdays were the exception. They slept as late as they wanted and ran errands in town, but even then, if Edgar happened to wake first, he'd sneak out to the barn and start the chores, hoping that just once his mother would open her eyes and realize there was nothing to do. Often before he had worked even 20 minutes, the barn doors would open and she'd walk in, puffy-eyed, weary, and looking thinner every week. On top of it all, there was the cough she'd developed. It doubled her over sometimes. You two are doing an amazing job, Dr. Papineau said. Can't believe how fast you've got back on your feet. I remember what it was like when Rose died. I wasn't fit for anything for months. He looked thoughtful. I'm just wondering if you can keep up the pace. Why couldn't we? His mother said. It won't be long before the weather turns, and things get so much easier when we can train outdoors. Then school lets out for the summer. That's going to make a big difference. And a couple months later, it'll start up again, Papineau said. He knew where the plates and silverware were, and he had dishes out, slices of pie. He liked to serve the desserts he brought. Well, what else can we do? His mother said, looking across. There's only the two of us here, and maybe we'll have to skip a litter in the fall. That would make things tight, but I've been going over our finances, and we could make ends meet. Sorry if that means your share is going to be a little smaller, but it's the best we can do for now. Papineau waved her comment aside with his fork. What I'm wondering is, have you considered that maybe the real solution involves 3 people? Meaning there's a Sawtelle boy in town who knows this kennel inside and out. Claude is hardly a boy, his mother said, and you know how things ended between him and Gar. Water under the bridge, isn't it? He's been helping me out at the office, Trudy. I have to tell you, he has a gift. I remember what he was like 20 years ago. And we both know how he learned all that. You don't get good at ministering to torn-up dogs unless you're around them a lot. Okay, I didn't come here to debate Claude's past. The thing is, where's the slack in your schedule, Trudy? There's no room for anything to go wrong, and eventually something always does. Look at the last year. How many things that happened could you have planned for? I'm not talking about Gar. I mean in the kennel. Your barn was hit by a tornado. Did you plan for that? I seem to recall at least one nursing mother last year with mastitis, and we both know how much time bottle feeding takes. Have you planned for that? All right, Paige, here's a question. Suppose we hired someone to help out. How would I pay them? The money isn't there. We make ends meet. We pay our bills. We have a little savings, period. That truck isn't going to last much longer, and when it's time to buy a new one, I don't want to be firing hired help to do it. I won't even start down that road. It was just an idea, Trudy, Dr. Papineau said. I'm trying to help. It was a bad idea, she said. Is that why you're here, to protect your investment? It finally began to dawn on Edgar what the references to Dr. Papineau's share meant. He signed a question at his mother, but she shook her head angrily and stood and stalked around the table. She ended up standing by the counter where Dr. Papineau had left the pipe tin. and in a single swift motion pitched it into the trash. I may not have been born here, but that doesn't mean I don't know how this place operates. After 20 years, 20 years, let me remind you, during which Claude was most definitely not here. Edgar's mother was 41 years old at the moment. He knew she could mask her feelings perfectly when she wanted to, because there were dogs who misbehaved expressly to get a reaction, not caring whether it was pleasure or anger. Oftentimes it wasn't until much later that he understood a dog had gotten under her skin. She was certainly capable of that same self-control during a dinner conversation, and yet there she stood, giving herself over to her anger, almost reveling in it. The dark circles under her eyes had disappeared, and her shoulders had dropped into a relaxed readiness, her posture suddenly sinuous and limber, like a dancer or a lioness. She looked as if she might as easily spring onto the table as curl up to sleep. Partly calculated, he supposed, to look as far from helpless as possible, wholly in control of their fate, but partly also a surrender to her own willfulness. He thought he ought to be scared by such a magisterial fit of temper, but in truth he had never felt safer in his life. Dr. Papineau, however, was entirely daunted. He tipped his chair back onto its rear legs and held hands out. "Whoa," he said. "Your decision. I'm not suggesting you do anything that doesn't feel right. But think about this. Eventually, something will go wrong. What are you going to do then? That's all I'm saying. What are you going to do then?" "Yes," Trudy said after Dr. Papineau had left. "He has a stake in the kennel. 10%. "Are there others?" Edgar asked. "No. Years ago, when we were strapped for money, Paige helped us out. Back then, it was impossible to get a loan, so he paid us $5,000 in exchange for a share in the kennel. He has obligations, though." "That's why you never pay him for vet work?" "Right. What about Claude?" "Claude sold your father his share in the kennel when your grandfather died." Edgar had more questions, but suddenly his mother looked exhausted, and there'd be plenty of chances to ask in the morning. Time and again, Edgar reread the letters from Brooks. They were like a puzzle to be solved. Brooks was given to proclamations and dire warnings. It's our timer. We'll finish this chapter. Pitched arguments were made for or against the importance of gait, hocks, flanks, the function of the tail, the optimum angle of the pasterns, how much this might vary between the fortunate field lions and the Sawtelle dogs, whether one could ever discriminate between willingness to work and more general intelligence, whether body sensitivity was learned or inherited. The arguments often ascended into theory. Brooks sounded like a man dragging Sawtelle into the age of science. "I have the advantage of knowing," he wrote, "that long after I am gone, my work will provide a foundation upon which future generations of dogs, breeders, and trainers may build. Skill and talent alone are not enough. If these are bound up in you and you alone, and not in data and precisely recorded procedures, what will your efforts amount to? A few dogs, a few successes, then nothing, only the briefest flash of light in darkness." There had been some setback in 1935, though Edgar couldn't tell what it was. Some illness had flashed through the kennel, perhaps, or some spectacular training failure. In any case, it was serious enough for Brooks to shift from debate to encouragement. "There's nothing to do now but take stock of your accomplishments," he wrote. "Now your records must serve you instead of the dogs. Study them. Look at how many of your dogs have succeeded in the world. Your records are a history of your accomplishments, John. They'll show you why you undertook this work in the first place." Edgar had never seen his father capriciously select a dog for breeding, but in those early days there was nothing yet to call a Sawtelle dog, just John Sawtelle's dog. What drove Brooks mad was Edgar's grandfather's habit of spotting a dog on the street and deciding it carried some essential quality. The replies from New Jersey sometimes rose to a shriek. "How many times have we argued about this, John? Each time you do this, you introduce more variability into your bloodlines than you will ever profit by. Why do you place your trust in chance?" Edgar arranged the letters from Brooks in chronological order. The last of them seemed to close the argument forever. It was dated December 16th, 1944. "John, you may be the most stubborn man I've ever met. Let me rebut your points one last time. Though I fear no one will ever change your mind on this, at least we're in agreement that by careful documentation of phenotype, One can increase or decrease the preponderance of a quality if one measures it objectively and reinforces it for many generations through selective breeding. The poorest farmers know this can be done and benefits from it. He chooses Herefords, Holsteins, or Guernseys, depending on his needs. He has definite opinions on whether a Percheron or a Belgian should stand in the traces. Likewise, we apply the scientific principles of heredity toward the perfection of a breed, so that instead of only one dog out of 2 litters being suitable for service, 90% make the grade. How are we doing this? By defining and measuring those qualities that make a good working dog. And this is where we differ. You feel less need to choose specific traits a priori, believing instead that excellent traits will simply emerge in the finest individuals, taken as a whole, are brought into the line. Let us employ the metaphor of salt. We can't see the salt in a glass of water, but we can taste it. Combining 2 slightly salty glasses and reducing them gives us a saltier result. Done enough, the invisible becomes visible. Salt crystals. We may not have set out to create salt crystals, but now we have them. This is analogous to what you propose. You've cleverly arranged to work with strong brine. You don't know what you will find if you continue to distill it, only that this tastes ever so slightly saltier than that. And so by the seat of your pants, you choose one cross over another. At Fortunate Fields, on the other hand, we not only know we are trying to produce salt crystals, we know the desired size, shape, and color of those crystals, and we have carefully documented the salinity of the sire and dam of every litter, as well as their offspring. Yet I have seen your records. You are nearly as rigorous as Fortunate Fields. I confess our rigor and precision wearies me at times. I don't claim our process is easy. Quite the opposite. If this were easy, it would have been done long ago, but I do claim that it is the only way to obtain reliable results. In the end, the difference between you and me comes down to the difference between the artist and the factory man. The artist does not know what he wants, but looks for good paint, good brushes, good canvas. He trusts that talents will produce a desirable result. Sadly, for most people, it does not. The factory man says, what can I make that I can rely on? It may not be the ideal, but I must be able to tell my customers that each time they buy, they will receive the same product. The factory man values predictability above mere excellence for good reason. Would you frequent a bakery where 1 cake in 10 was inspired, but the other 9 inedible? I realize this portrays you as the romantic figure and me as the plodder. Perhaps you think that diminishes me. I do not. Change the analogy from bread to medicine, and you will feel the same urgency I do. You might be willing to gamble on that odd cake, but if your infant is sick, you will choose the medicine with predictable results every time. I sacrifice brilliance to make a good medicine available to mankind. No one can say if you are that person who, given good paint, good brushes, and a fine canvas, can produce something better than the factory man. That is, and has always been, beyond the realm of science. You do have the attitude of the dreamer about you. For that reason, I haven't the heart to argue any more about this. It's a hopeless task. And for a simple factory man like me, an effort must be abandoned once its hopelessness is exposed. Only the artist perseveres in such circumstances. However, I'll leave you with a question. Suppose, guided only by intuition, you capture the greatness you seek. Never mind that you cannot define greatness scientifically. What makes you think you will even recognize it when it appears? Some believe that gross animal behavior may be reducible to a set of simple, indivisible traits, and that only the multiplicity of ways in which these traits combine creates the illusion of complexity. Suppose you stumble across one small change with dozens of ramifications in the gross behavior of the animal. How will you know what you've done? How will you ever achieve it again? The painter who creates one masterpiece, never to produce another, is well known. If you have a success, it will most likely be singular. Can you be satisfied with that, Joan? We'll end there. I hope you are enjoying this. I have not yet taken the book home to read. I've read this once before. I think I told you that, and that's why we chose it. It's one of my very favorite books. But I think about it all the time, especially as I interact with my dogs. I hope that you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next time.